Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Tracey, and I have the pleasure of chairing the session today, which will see the release of the National Social and Economic Survey of Recreational Fishing report, and also a presentation of some of its key findings. So I realise this is a highly anticipated event, and I'm sure we're all very excited to see the results. Travis, your foot's twitching a lot down there. I don't know what's going on there. But without further ado, let's launch into it. So I'd like to welcome to the stage the member for McEwen, Rob Mitchell MP, a very keen supporter of recreational fishing, to open on behalf of Mr Watt to officially release the report and open the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, it is very exciting to be here today after a fantastic weekend at the Expo, where I think everything went really well. My wallet was emptied, so trolleys will be right for another 12 months. And thanks to Ben from WRFC10 for letting my wife know that I bought a lot of stuff when I didn't tell her. To start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, to remind ourselves that this was, is and will always be Aboriginal land. And in this week of national action, I want to reiterate our government's commitment to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full and a voice to Parliament that will be voted on later this year. I'm here on behalf of Senator Murray Watt, the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, who sends his apologies. But if we're going to be honest, when I heard this was on, I did suggest to Murray that he could find something else to do to give me the opportunity to be here. And it is an absolute pleasure to join you because to share your passion in recreational fishing is just, one of Australia's greatest pastimes. And I have strong feelings about this subject. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. I can recall when I was a kid, my grandfather taking me up to the Goulburn and fishing for redfin, my dad teaching his grandkids, and now I'm teaching my grandkids. Although their interest in fishing for a long time is waned very quickly as they jump onto the iPad and watch YouTube or something like that. But there is no better way for us to connect to our land and water than heading to the beach, dragging out the boat, sitting on a pier but casting a line. And for many Australians, it's a rite of passage. As I said, that just connects this generation to the next. It's a state of mind and a way of life. And apparently, according to my notes, you can catch a great meal if you're lucky. But as Travis keeps reminding me constantly, it's called fishing, Rob, not catching. In fact, if we look at Australians, are estimated to spend around 28 million days of fishing per year. And that's no surprise because our fisheries are renowned around the world for their unpolluted waters, good fisheries management regimes to ensure that we have the highest quality and sustainable seafood. We continually seek to sustainability to get the best out of our environment, and we cannot rest on our laurels. Recreational fishing is an important part of our national identity, and this is no surprise given we are bordered by 60,000 kilometres of coastline and blessed with some of the great inland waterways across the globe. Recreational fishing contributes to the health and wellbeing of many Australians and provides economic and social benefits, particularly in regional areas. It's a diverse sector with people who may fish one day a year, to game fishers who spend a fortune on goods and equipment and go out as often as they can, and Bob Baldwin's there shaking his head, I know Bob knows about it, to people like myself who get every weekend they can to sit out on a boat and have some fun. But whatever you do, however you do it, the key is to enjoy it and to make sure that we have fun and look after our environment at the same time. We want you to know that this government understands how rec fishing underpins prosperity in our nation. It's been over 20 years since we last had a national snapshot of the contribution of recreational fishing to Australia's economy and society. The National Social and Economic Survey of Rec Fishers released today has shown that Australians continue wetting a line at 4.2 million, or 1 in 5 Australian adults, estimated to participate in fishing each year. Recreational fishing delivers over 100,000 jobs and around $11 billion per year, including direct and indirect contributions to our economy. Rec fishers are found to have, on average, higher levels of wellbeing than non-fishers. Unless you're like me and you don't catch anything, you get a bit stressed by the time you get home. But there's also those who fish more often have a higher wellbeing out of all of them. And that's an important thing to note in this day and age. Recreational fishing supports positive social connections, a connection to nature, relaxation, and can help achieve recommended levels of physical activity. The survey results also show that most Australians have a positive outlook to recreational fishing, with 79% of Australians, adults, considering recreational fishing to be an acceptable activity. Fishers also contribute to environmental stewardship by picking up the rubbish when out fishing, while some participate in the fantastic work of habitat restoration activities or donate to organisations who are out improving aquatic health. Through protecting the sustainability of our fish stocks and supporting better representation of the fishing sector, we're making sure the industry will continue to prosper. And we must continue to balance social, economic considerations of rec fishing with the need to ensure that we have sustainable management of Australia's fisheries. We have the best managed fisheries in the world, and our recreational fishers play a key role in keeping it world-class and sustainable. So with that in mind, I thank you for the invitation to be here today, to have the opportunity to release the National Social and Economic Survey of Rec Fishers 218 to 221, and I've got the executive summary here, and I do say read it. It's a very important read for our future. So with that, I say to everyone, tight lines, enjoy, have fun. It is great, and we have moved from Victoria, where we have the Towards 1 million, and today I get the honour of putting on the hat to say we double it and head towards 2 million. The more people we get out fishing, the better off our nation is. So enjoy. Thank you very much for your time, and it is, as I said, it is an absolute pleasure to be able to be here. I don't call this work, this is fun, and I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Okay, it's all cancelled. Rob's just giving away the punchline. So to start with, we would like to invite Andy Moore. So Andy was the lead author on this report and probably going to be one of the most relieved men in Melbourne today to be able to hand this off and put this behind. It's a massive job to do something like this. Andy's going to give the first presentation. Oh, that's high tech. Right, someone's doing it for me. Is someone doing it for me? Here we go. They're opening it up. And go. So the first one is on how many Australians are going fishing. So this is about the participation in recreational fishing in Australia. Thank you, Andy. There's the technology.
Thanks, Sean, and what a wonderful introduction. I'm really glad that slide worked because my interpretive dance isn't so flash these days. It is really a pleasure to be here. There's an enormous amount of work, as Sean said, and Sean was an integral part of that, as were many scientists from around the country in developing the methodologies for this particular survey. We wanted to make sure that in that time we developed a lot of methodologies moving forward that made the survey both really robust so people could trust the outcomes, but also to make it cheaper so that we didn't have to wait 20 years between surveys. And so we put an enormous amount of work into that, a lot of testing, a lot of modelling, a lot of benchmarking to make sure the results of this survey are both robust and deliver the types of information that the rec sector was after. And it's worth pointing out that we did this in collaboration with Australian Recreational Fishing Foundation to come up with some of the key metrics that they were looking for. So moving on, in that survey design, so given this is the first talk of the series, I'll go into a little bit in the survey design. As I said, we put a lot of effort into how we came up with a survey that didn't cost a lot of money. We did develop an initial survey design back in 2014-15 that cost about $6.8 million to run. We were asked to reduce the cost and maintain the level of robustness in the data. We put a lot of effort into doing that, and there's a whole team of people, which I'll get to shortly, that work with that. But we put a lot of effort into it. The survey was conducted in 3 different phases, and that was to try and get a handle on various parts of the population and in order to be able to benchmark the data that we were using. So the first part of the survey was part of the Regional Wellbeing Survey that was conducted at the end of 2018. And that was a whole of population survey. We were able to nest a whole bunch of questions within that to give us participation numbers, some of the stuff we'll cover today, but also other questions that typically aren't answered or asked in recreational fishing surveys. And that was a particularly useful point in that typically what we ask is, have you fished in the last 12 months, or are you going to fish in the next 12 months? If the answer is no, then you're typically excluded from the survey. And there was a whole range of questions that we wanted to ask of the general population and lapsed fishers that we couldn't do that by only asking people who fished in the last 12 months. So we got a whole bunch of population level data that we couldn't get from just rec fishing data. So we got about 11,500 participants from around Australia in that first phase, and I'll talk about some of the numbers that came out of that. We also had a second phase, which was part of a large online survey where we recruited people into the survey through different means. And a key part of this was to run an online survey. I've been saying for years that we don't use online surveys because they're non-probability based and very difficult to extrapolate to the population level and know where your errors are. So we put an enormous amount of effort into this to benchmark the data so that we could run an online survey and we could recruit people using various means. We could measure the bias, we could fix for that bias, and we could have corrected, weighted data sets up to the population and have confidence in those estimates. So that phase 2 survey went through from the end of 2019 through to mid-2021, and we got just over 20,000 participants in that part of the survey. Made up of both people who were regular fishers, lapsed fishers, and people who've never fished. And we also did what is very similar to a standard diary phase. Although it was an online phase, we looked at participation, we looked at how many trips people did in order to generate the economic numbers that are used throughout this. We did a whole bunch of trip-based stuff, and that went for 18 months. And I'll get into that a little bit in a moment. But that's the general design of the survey. It was done at a national scale, but a lot of the metrics we use in this can go right down to reasonably low levels. A lot of the economic data, we're able to do comparisons from capital cities through to regional areas. So, as we just heard, participation rates are at about 20%. That's very similar to, well, it's basically the same as we found 20 years ago in the National Rec Survey back then. The population has increased over time. Australian population has increased by about 30%. And so, despite the participation rate staying the same, the overall numbers of participants has gone up. So, 4.2 million rec fishers. If we look at the participation rates in the next white map, you can see that that's the number of people in each jurisdiction that participate in recreational fishing. You can see it's highest in the Northern Territory and lowest in some of the southern states. And if you take those numbers out to the number of fishers per jurisdiction, again, you can see it in the most populous states. So when we're looking at it, we can see participation rate is highest in places like the NT, but a low population base. When you compare that to high population base areas like New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and others, a lot more people undertaking fishing. So that spread of effort around the country, and I'll get into effort a little bit in a moment, but you can certainly see there where majority of fishing is taking place. And if we look at who's doing the fishing, if we just look at basic demographics, there's a lot more in the report on this, but if we look at some of the basic demographics, then I suppose it's telling us the same story as previous recreational fishing surveys, that more males than females go fishing every year, that the demographic cohort of 30 to 44, where people typically have kids, and that's related often to the way people fish every year. The majority of people fish certain days a year, and that's typically parents taking their kids fishing, that people in regional areas fish more than those in metropolitan areas. Nothing new in any of these stats, just reinforcing them, and that people of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander descent fish more than other Australians that aren't from that background. So again, nothing particularly standing out in that, but good numbers. So as I mentioned before, one of the key parts of this was about collecting data, not just of wreck fishers. They can give you a certain amount of information, but it was to collect information of people who were, potentially lapsed fishers or who've never fished, and to ask them questions about why they haven't fished and of the general population. So we collected a whole range of information throughout the various phases of the survey on exactly that, to get at some of those metrics that really haven't been asked in previous fishing surveys. There was, plenty of information coming from people who'd been lapsed fishers and hadn't fished the last 12 months or the last 2 to 5 years, who had never fished, who gave us a whole bunch of information about why they'd never fished or why they stopped fishing. Really useful information. When we were able to ask the general population about this stuff, we asked about the activities that they valued most and they undertook the most. And fishing came out as number 10. Walking and swimming, very, very high. I think it's worth pointing out, when looking at the numbers, rec fishing came out around about the same as cycling, a really popular pastime. So, this is taken from the population, not just the fishers, but of the total population, that fishing is a highly desirable activity within society. And lots of people, as we've just seen, undertake that activity. When we look at fishing effort, so the number of events around the country, I suppose we've seen in the last bunch of the statewide surveys or the previous national surveys, that the majority of people, when they go fishing, fish less than 5 days a year. And so they're typically family fishers. They're taking their kids fishing on holidays and those sort of things. So they don't fish much, they don't catch much, they don't spend much, but they are the majority. So we did a whole bunch of work on this about how to sample those fishers, but also the more avid fishers, the people who go and fish a lot, catch a lot, spend a lot, travel a lot, to get a decent representative sample of those guys that we could weight up to the total population. So, 68% of fishers fish less than 5 days a year. So plenty of people go fishing, but not a lot of effort generated by those guys, but there is a lot of them. And some people fish more than 52 days a year. There are people that are far luckier than me to get to go fishing a heck of a lot. Hopefully I get to do more of that after this thing's finished. You can see there that there was a whole range of other activities about where people fish, whether they fish in freshwater, estuaries, and it's fair to say that most people fish in a whole range of areas. There's some that are fairly specialised, but in general, fishers fish in a whole range of areas. If we're looking at overall fishing effort as fishing events, back in 2001, we had 23 million fishing events, separate fishing events. That's increased, as you can imagine, if the number of anglers has increased around the country substantially. The number of fishing events has gone up to 28.5 million fishing events. You can see there how that's mapped around the country. Again, when you look at the same as number of people fishing around the country, it's in the highly populous states that have reasonable levels of fishing participation, but they also have higher population levels in those areas. So quite a lot of fishing events in those things. It's worth mentioning that this survey, as has already been discussed, is a social and economic survey. It didn't look at catch, and it did that for a particular reason, that the jurisdictions are already running their own surveys. They're collecting data on catch that is fit for purpose, so it wasn't seen as a priority in this survey. One of the things that we got a lot of criticisms about was running a survey through some pretty nasty events. When we kicked off phase 2 of this survey, it was in the end of 2019, at the end of a protracted drought that led into the Black Summer bushfires and then into COVID. As you can imagine, there was a bit of anxiety at that time trying to run a survey. People were concentrating on things like their house burning down and then going into lockdown. And we saw massive decreases in effort, especially in places like Victoria here. We did see increases in fishing effort in some places, Queensland, WA, especially with fly-in, fly-out workers who couldn't go back to their jobs and had a lot of spare time and they went fishing. So effort in some of those places increased quite dramatically. We were going to run as a standard 12-month diary part of the survey. We extended that to 18 months to look at the impacts of COVID. But it's worth saying that we collected a fair bit of information in 2018, and we were also asking for people in the survey what they did, how much they spent, how much they went fishing in the previous 12 months. So they might have been in COVID lockdown when they answered the survey, but we're actually asking about the 12 months beforehand. So a lot of the information was collected before COVID had an impact on their fishing. So, as I said before, we were able to ask questions of people about why they stopped fishing. And I think this is really, really useful information. And I know that the text might be fairly small up there, but it was really around some of those social connections for people. So we asked questions, again, why they'd stopped fishing more than 5 years ago. And it was a lack of friends. Some of the people that they fished with had passed away, were now ill, they'd moved away, so they lost that social connection. And we see that as a common thread through this, a lot of social connection in fishing. Life got busy, so they weren't able to do it. As someone who spent a whole bunch of years on this thing, I can certainly understand it. And as someone, again, who has relatively young kids, you move through particular areas where you've got different caring roles and responsibilities. Affordability becomes difficult. You get changes in your health, one of the things that was really quite apparent in working on this particular project was the measure that we typically use for whether someone's a really active angler is avidity, the number of days that you fish. And one thing that really became quite clear in this is there's plenty of people out there who consider themselves avid fishers, so really keen fishers. They watch all the fishing media, they buy magazines, they buy a lot of tackle, but at certain times of their life they can't go fishing. So they can't get out, they've got caring responsibilities or their health is not there. They consider themselves a really keen fisher. But if we just use the avidity metric, we don't pick them up. And that became really clear in this survey. So we asked questions of fishers throughout the survey about not only avidity, but about the importance of fishing, which we think is a much better metric for some of this stuff. Again, we asked questions to people about why they'd never taken up fishing. And I suppose time and time again we heard stories of no one to fish with and no one to teach me. So that family part of fishing where we know a lot of people get introduced to fishing by going fishing with their family through the holidays, and when they're not taught, they don't take it up later on. So I think for me that was a fairly clear part of this, that if you're not taught how to fish at a young age, the likelihood of you taking it up later is significantly reduced. That people were too busy. They were concerned for the welfare of the fish was another one. They didn't want to buy gear. But we certainly heard from a lot of people, again, who would like to take their kids fishing, potentially single parents and those sort of things that didn't feel safe when they went to the water. Or they felt they didn't have the required set of skills to tie knots and various bits and pieces, fairly basic things that they felt they couldn't get in other areas. So again, that was an issue, and of course that risk of injury and health was a fairly substantial demotivator for people. And that's where I'll wrap things up just on participation. We'll go into various other parts of the survey. It's worth pointing out that this was a large project with a lot of very clever people. We'll hear from Jacki Schirmer at the moment and Anders, but there was a whole range of other really clever, talented people who made this all happen, and these certainly things don't get done in a vacuum. So thank you very much, and I'll pass on.
Thanks, Andy. I'll clarify one point there, because Trav's probably sitting there making some furious notes, that I believe on the slide with participation, that was 18 plus.
Yes.
So.
No, we're all over that.
No, I'm sure you are.
We're up to 3 million now.
I'm sure you are. Okay, so Now I'd like to welcome to the stage Anders Magnusson, and he's going to run us through the economic contributions of recreational fishing.
Good afternoon. So my name's Anders Magnusson. I'm an economist from BDO Econ Search and co-investigator on this FRDC-funded project. I'm going to be presenting on just one of the chapters in the final report, which was released today, on the economic contribution of recreational fishing to Australia. So first, I'm going to tell a little story about economic contribution and how that works. I'll give you some key definitions, outline the method very briefly, and then we'll look at the results in a few different ways to understand what sort of information we have in the results. We'll look at the big numbers at the national level, the regional results, and some interesting interregional effects as well. And then some really important points about what these results say and what they don't say, and therefore what we can do with them and what we cannot do. But first, you've heard these big numbers already. These are the national results. So economic contribution of recreational fishing to Australia in the 2018-19 financial year, estimated to be $11.5 billion in GDP, and supporting over 100,000 full-time equivalent jobs. So you might ask, how does this fisher sitting on their esky here support 100,000 jobs in the Australian economy? Well, I'll tell you, someone here probably knows who that is, and I'm sure you've all seen the image, but I'm going to tell you a made-up story about why they don't really support that much contribution, but others do. So some fishers, I'm sure you know who, fly across the country. They sign up for competitions and they spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on charter fishing experiences. Some fishers buy boats and kayaks and four-wheel drives and holiday houses, all just so that they can get to their favourite recreational fishing spots. And all of this supports jobs in sales yards, brokers, retailers, airlines, taxi companies, charter businesses. Some fishers spend thousands of dollars on fishing gear. We've heard some confessions of that already. And they get them shipped express post or via courier to themselves because they just can't wait to get their hands on the new gadgets. And this, of course, supports jobs at these online retailers, at the importers who bring these products in, and, of course, the couriers bringing them across the country. Some fishers buy ice and live bait from local shops every time they go fishing, supporting the people who run those shops, the people who make that ice. This fisher here, in my opinion, looking at this photo, probably lives nearby, has dragged their esky from their house a couple of blocks up the road. They're using the same old gear that they've always used, but I reckon they've probably bought a bag of ice from the local shop to put in that esky to bring their catch home afterwards. So maybe they are contributing just a little bit to the economy. And all of that activity that I've explained is what we've captured here in our estimates of economic contribution. It's the economic activity supported by rec fishing activity, and we measure it here using the same metrics that are commonly used to measure the aggregate activity in the national economy, commonly gross domestic product, GDP, and employment. So we've seen that the work we've done here answers the first question on the slide. How does recreational fishing activity support economic activity measured in GDP and employment? But there's a couple of other very interesting and very important questions that I want to point out that are out of scope of this work. For example, the first, This fisher here, I've already said, they're not contributing much to GDP, right, to the economy. But I don't think that fisher cares very much about their contribution to GDP. I think they're enjoying themselves there just fine. And if you stopped them in the street on the way to the wharf and offered them $100 to turn around and go home, there's a good chance they would just laugh you off and keep on walking to the wharf and going fishing. Looks like a beautiful day after all. So that implies that this fisher is getting a lot of value out of this activity here, even though the only thing they've bought today is a bag of ice. Now, that value is not counted in national GDP. That $100 or whatever it is, that value that this fisher is getting from this experience. And therefore, it's not counted in this 11 billion that we've estimated here. That's an important point, so I just wanted to make that clear. Another question that is important and worth asking about rec fishing is, what would rec fishers do if they couldn't go fishing? And how would the economic activity associated with that other activity compare to that of rec fishing? That's a fraught question, trying to understand what people would do otherwise, trying to model that and then trying to make a comparison is full of uncertainty and is probably not a particularly plausible scenario to be modelling anyway. So that said, it is useful to model specific changes where, plausible changes where the change in economic activity is relevant. Zoning changes, access to resources, species regulations, some individual actions where we want to understand how does that affect the economy. Those are questions worth asking, but not asked here. And therefore that also implies here that our 100,000 jobs and 11 billion GDP, we're not implying that's going to disappear if those people couldn't go rec fishing. It's more of a snapshot of what activity is supported in this 2018-19 financial year by that fishing activity. Now, underneath that $11 billion and 100,000 jobs, we have a couple of categories of economic contribution, which we call direct and flow-on. You might also hear flow-on called indirect. The direct activity is the activity occurring at the businesses that provide goods and services to the rec fishers. So that's the person at the bait shop selling the ice to the fisher. And the flow-on effects all occur behind the scenes of the bait shop. And there's a couple of categories here called production-induced and consumption-induced flow-on effects. I've got an example on the next slide, which is a better way of describing those to you. So our fisher buys this ice from the bait shop. The bait shop needs to purchase that ice from its own suppliers. It needs to get it transported to the shop, it needs to keep it frozen. And each of those suppliers, manufacturing the ice, transporting it, and keeping the freezers running, they all have their own suppliers, and this business-to-business transaction between suppliers is what we've represented here as production-induced flow-on effects. At all of those businesses, there's also people working there, earning wages, and they are spending those wages back into the economy on consumption goods and services, their groceries, rent, entertainment, and so on. And that activity associated with all of that respending of wages is what we capture as consumption-induced flow-on effects. And this all comes back to that initial purchase by this fisher of a bag of ice from a bait shop. So perhaps they're contributing a little bit more than we gave them credit for. Just a couple of formal definitions of the indicators we've used here. But what you should think of GDP representing is the total production value of market goods produced in Australia in that year. And it is the sum of business profits, wages, salaries, and taxes. And employment, the way that we have defined it here, is in full-time equivalent terms. So this is 100,000 full-time jobs. In reality, people work multiple jobs, people work less than full-time often as well. But full-time equivalent jobs is a good metric for understanding just how much employment is supported here. A quick overview of the method. I just wanted to show a schematic here so you can see the way that the different data sources came together. The blue rectangles are data sources and the grey are pieces of analysis or processes. So as Andy explained, we surveyed rec fishers. We surveyed the population and we asked rec fishers about their spending associated with their fishing activity. We asked them what they spent money on, how much, where they spent it, and why, because it was important for us to be able to work out, is it actually attributable to rec fishing or not? We then scaled up that sample to the population to be representative of the Australian population. And then we went through a process of transforming that expenditure data into what we call output. Output is an economic term that more or less means revenue earned by Australian businesses. So that's really important because a rec fisher might spend some money on imported product, that money goes overseas, it's not contributing to the Australian economy. So we exclude that. And we also made sure we included only the expenditure that we could really attribute to that rec fisher's recreational fishing activity. So some of the things that they might do, like travel or buy a vehicle, they're going to have multiple uses or multiple purposes. So what we did was to just attribute the proportion of use or purpose for that item that relates to their recreational fishing activity. So with that, we put those expenditure estimates into an economic model of Australia called a multi-region input-output model, and that calculated for us our direct and flow-on effects in terms of jobs and GDP. Now on to the results. So rec fishing in Australia in the 18-19 financial year contributed $11 billion and 100,000 full-time equivalent jobs. Don't worry, I think that's the last time I'll say that sentence. You can see in the table here, we've broken down each of those indicators by those direct and flow-on effects that I explained earlier. And just looking at the employment column, you see that about 40,000 jobs were directly supported by rec fishing, and the other 60,000 were through flow-on effects. 22,000 of them being production-induced, and the other 38,000 consumption-induced. This breaks down the 100,000 jobs, full-time jobs, by 5 different categories of expenditure that we asked about in the survey. And you'll see that about half was associated with the 2 largest categories, fishing gear, tackle, the bait and ice falls in there as well, and overnight travel. And the other half of those jobs are supported by vessel running and maintenance, capital expenditures, houses, vehicles, vessels, and day trip travel. Just want to note an important point about capital here is that when you buy and sell a holiday house, perhaps, the only real production or activity occurring in the economy in doing that is the little margin that the estate agent or the broker is earning when that happens. So for that reason, we haven't included the full value of these houses and these expensive assets here. It's just the economic activity associated with making that transaction. Now, the survey analysis and the economic model all function at a greater capital city statistical area basis. What that means is we're able to look at the economic contribution to each region in terms of the capital city and the rest of the state or territory. we're also able to filter down the results to see just to the state of residence or the region of residence of these wreck fishers to see, right, people who live in Melbourne, what contribution do they make to each other region? And you see here that most of the contribution is occurring in capital cities. A lot of people live in capital cities and fish near home, but that's also because people tend to spend near home for particular items, even if they're going fishing elsewhere. And finally, even when you do spend into regional economies, your direct expenditure is supported by the suppliers of those businesses. Many of them are back in population centres and capital cities, so you have some flow-on effects coming back too. So here, I have filtered the fishers down to, we're just looking at the contribution by Melbourne residents, since we're in Melbourne today. And you'll see here that the orange in Victoria there is the capital city region of Victoria, and you see that that's unsurprisingly where most of that contribution is made, but there's still quite substantial contributions made to regional Vic and across the borders as well. Now, all I've done here is change that filter, so now we're looking at regional Victorian residents. The contribution there, again, people are spending close to home, they're probably taking trips close to home as well, and that is supporting a lot of local activity, but also activity across borders and in capital cities. And my last slide, I just wanted to make a few very important points about the context of these results and how they can be used. So what this work does, it demonstrates the economic significance of recreational fishing in Australia and some interesting regional patterns of that contribution. And it does allow for careful comparison against other economic contribution studies. What it doesn't do, as I've already explained, it doesn't capture that experience value. So there is more work to be done, more to investigate there. And it doesn't tell us what would happen if wreck fishing was banned overnight. And a couple of points to make about why I have underlined the word careful here in making comparisons. There is no professional standard for undertaking economic contribution analysis, unfortunately, but we've been guided here in the judgments, the assumptions, the methods that we've applied along the way by the big group of people that Andy had up on the screen earlier. So we think we've made our best judgments along the way, but that doesn't mean that the study you're comparing to was done using the same assumptions or with the same scoping. So for example, you might see if you look at the state level results in the report, you'll see that our numbers here are actually quite a bit larger than a lot of the previous work that was done in the States. And I believe most of that difference is explained by some issues of scoping, particularly that the national study includes expenditure and economic activity in a state attributable to all wreck fishers in Australia, regardless of where they live, whereas state studies have typically just focused on residents of that state contributing to their own state. And the other comparison that I'm sure a lot of people will make is with the recent National Commercial Fishing and Aquaculture Economic Contribution Study that was published a couple of years ago. If you look at the numbers there, you'll see they're about half of the contribution, the national contribution we found in this study. And I believe most of the difference there is explained by the difference in how much of the supply chain has been included in the study. So if you look at that other report, you'll see it includes production and some primary processing, but not transport, seafood marketing, tourism, food service, and that sort of thing. So, so comparisons can be made, but it's really important to understand the context of those studies that you're comparing. And that's it from me. Thank you.
you, Anders. Some very big numbers there. It really shows how important the recreational fishery is in Australia. Next we have... Is this on me? Jacki. And hit the screen. They're doing it for me again. Loading the page. Here we go. Okay, so Jacki Schirmer is going to be telling us about wellness. So this will be an interesting one. I guess if you're going to be trotting 20 kilometres to go trout fishing, it's probably good for your health, but if you're out fishing with a carton full of beer, I'm not sure. But mental health is also very important, so I'm looking forward to hearing this one.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Can I just have a raise of hands? How many of you, last time you went fishing, said to yourself, today I make a contribution to Australia's GDP? Oh, come on. So, seriously. How many of you went, yeah, man, might enjoy a day of fishing? Yep. Okay, so let's talk about the important stuff. No shade to Anders there at all. Is recreational fishing good for your health and well-being? This is a really important question, and we're really excited that as part of this study, we've been able to look at this in much more depth than has been possible a lot of the time in previous work. All right, so I'm going to start with a little bit of context. Why do we care about well-being? Sounds like a really fluffy concept. It's a bit motherhoody. I'm a mother, I'm allowed to say that. We are looking at well-being not because it's a nice to have. We're looking at it because we're increasingly recognising that well-being is a bottom line essential. Internationally, we've seen a shift to people saying we must measure human progress based on the well-being of the population, not on economic growth. And the reason they're saying that is A, because it's a good thing to say, but because there's increasing evidence that supporting people's overall well-being has massive benefits in a whole range of ways. So if you think about health spending in Australia, 10% of our GDP is spent on health, 4% on mental ill health. Overweight and obesity related spending, $8.6 billion in 2011 to 12. Now, if we look at wellbeing research, what we're finding is when we measure subjective wellbeing, how you're feeling, and we measure it the right way, and we track those people over time, people who report higher levels of wellbeing live on average 7 to 10 years longer, but spend less on healthcare through that longer lifespan than their shorter lived friends. Building wellbeing has similar benefits across the economy to reducing smoking rates, according to a range of estimates, and that's probably a conservative estimate. In recognition of that, the UN has its International Day of Happiness. The OECD has for over a decade had its Better Life Index. And that informed New Zealand's wellbeing budgeting approach, which many of you will have heard of. We've got lots of examples of countries that are now implementing measures that say we don't just measure wellbeing, we use it to inform wellbeing budgeting by our treasuries. And most recently in Australia, our federal treasury has started the Measuring What Matters program, and they have flagged that they anticipate they will be evaluating investments based on whether there is evidence that those investments will result in an improvement in wellbeing. So we're seeing a very changing landscape, and for me, I'm really excited because I'm a wellbeing researcher, and finally people are getting that that's really important. So what's the relevance to recreational fishing? As part of the wellbeing literature, we look at hundreds of things that influence your wellbeing, because your wellbeing on any given day or in any given year is the outcome of a lot of different aspects of your life. Recreational fishing is just one. But what we do know is that a large and very rapidly growing body of evidence shows that if you go out and do recreational activities in nature areas, your wellbeing is higher. So just to give you an example, here's some of the papers I've read in the last couple of months as I've tried to keep up with the literature. In the last year alone, I've tagged 500 articles showing wellbeing outcomes of nature contact. If you're a speed reader and you could read all of those different headings, what you would have also noticed is that none of them had recreational fishing in the heading. So a big issue for fishing is that almost all of the now hundreds of studies that are looking at the wellbeing benefits of outdoor nature recreation have examined activities other than recreational fishing. So we wanted to really change that with this project. So as part of the National Rec Fishing Survey, we compared the wellbeing of recreational fishers to the Australian population. I'll tell you how we did it in a minute. But an important thing to flag is that we had to pick what sort of wellbeing we were looking at. Most nature-based studies look at whether your mood changes. How do you feel before you do something and after? Or how do you feel a week later? We decided we'd go a bit beyond that. All those benefits I talked about, things like longer lifespan, they're associated with your long-term subjective wellbeing, not so much with those shorter-term changes in mood. So we decided we would be a little bit bold and measure people's longer-term wellbeing and see if we could actually see a difference. So I'm going to give the headline findings and then explain why or how we got to them. The headline findings are that we found going fishing, firstly, helps you maintain healthy levels of wellbeing during normal times in life. Think about it like your car. If you get a regular oil change, you get regular maintenance, it stays pretty healthy. Same with our wellbeing. If we do all the little day-to-day things that help us maintain it, we can keep it at healthy levels. We also found, though, that going fishing supports wellbeing when we're going through some of the hardest times in life, divorce, death of a loved one, and that's quite different to your everyday checkup or change of oil in the car. This is like fishing helps you when the timing belt just exploded. So we found both of those, which is quite unusual. Most activities don't help with both of those things. We found that going fishing particularly seems to do this when our fishing helps us get social connection, helps us relax, and involves nature connection, which it pretty much always does. And we also did find that amongst the avid fishers, going fishing contributes a lot to meeting minimum recommended physical activity guidelines. So, how do I know this? To explain our findings, we need to just look a little bit at how wellbeing works. And this is a little different to how people think it does. We measure wellbeing with these long-term measures on a scale that goes from 0, your absolute lowest wellbeing, to 100, your absolute highest. And it's been done in thousands of studies internationally. It's why we use these measures. And what we know is that the majority of the population sits almost all of their life in a tiny little band of that 0 to 100 space. Your typical wellbeing is in that little light blue band across the top. And it takes a really big life stress to knock you out of that. So that's called your homeostatic level of wellbeing. So tomorrow, just ask people, how's your homeostasis going? Are you at the right level? So what we do know is that if you're lucky, nothing ever knocks you out of that. If you're unlucky, and unfortunately most of us will be at one or more points in life, you'll have some major stresses in life, and that will cause your wellbeing to decline. So I'm just seeing if I can get this to do the right thing. There we go. Oh, I didn't do my beautiful animation. That's terrible. All right, so that stressful life event usually temporarily knocks your wellbeing down, and if you've got the right conditions, you will eventually recover your wellbeing to those normal levels. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't have those right conditions like good social connection, the ability to do things like go fishing. So that's what we were looking at. And this is really an important thing because we know if your wellbeing doesn't recover after those big stressful events, sadly we've got much poorer life outcomes for you. We know that from a lot of studies as well. So we used two really commonly used, well-validated long-term measures of subjective wellbeing. I won't go into detail about them, but for those who are excited about it, please see me afterwards. I love it when people want to talk, validated measures to use in surveys. We collected data on, and they all measured your wellbeing in a way that looks at your long-term underlying wellbeing, not your shorter-term changes in mood. We collected data on wellbeing in 3 separate surveys conducted at different points in time, some before COVID, some during, some when there was more or less lockdown. And we did a ton of analysis. So, question 1, that first one where I said going fishing maintains maintenance of healthy wellbeing. It is your oil change on the car. What we did here was said, let's survey the whole population. Remember Andy said we did surveys that were of the whole population. They were part of the Regional Wellbeing Survey, which isn't focused on fishing. That reduces our risk of salience bias. Across our 3 surveys, 2 of them collecting data via the Regional Wellbeing Survey, 1 via our dedicated survey of rec fishers. In all 3 of them, people who had fished in the last 12 months had significantly higher rates of healthy wellbeing compared to those who had not gone fishing in the last 12 months. Now, the difference varied depending on what your comparison populations were. If you just compare current fishers to everyone else, including people who've never wanted to fish in your life, it's a smaller difference, but it's actually still significant. If you compare people who've fished in the last 12 months to those who really love fishing but weren't able to go, it's actually a much bigger wellbeing gap. So not being able to go fishing when you love it, that's stopping you getting the oil change on your car, and you need to find either an alternative way to get that wellbeing benefit, or you need to be able to get back out fishing. And we did a lot of controlling for different factors we know also influence wellbeing, like age and gender and income and where you live, and that result still held. But there was still a really important question, and a few of you are probably asking it. So is it that people get happier when they go fishing? Or is it that you're just more likely to go fishing when things are going better in life? And we really needed to resolve that to be able to say whether these results were meaningful. So what we were able to do was look at, if you've experienced some of the worst stressful events in the last 12 months, are you more or less likely to go fishing? Because if the first statement's true, people who go fishing, if the second statement's true, happier people are more likely to go fishing, then we should see rates of fishing participation dive amongst the people who've had stressful life events. We didn't see that. So if you look on the dark blue bars, are people who experienced 1 or more personal stress events like divorce, like death of a friend or a family member, like loss of employment. 24.5% of them went fishing in the last 12 months compared to 20.6% of the general population. That was the 2018 data. In 2020, when we were all a bit more restricted, it was pretty similar across the 2 groups. That tells us that the higher wellbeing of people who fished in the last 12 months is not because people are more likely to go fishing when life is good. If anything, they're slightly more likely to go fishing when times are bad. So that was good because we were a little worried about what we might find there. Then we looked at that group of people who'd experienced those significant life stresses, and we said, okay, let's compare the people who've had the really awful things happen in life over the last 12 months or 2 years. We varied the time frame across our different surveys to test for consistency and see what changed things. And we said, okay, if they go fishing, are they more or less likely to have low wellbeing? This graph's showing the proportion with unhealthily low levels of wellbeing, because we know that's what you're at risk of when you've had a stressful event. So on the very left-hand side, that 28.2% of people, they're the ones who didn't, so the ones in the light blue, they're the ones who didn't go fishing in the last 12 months but had stressful events. The ones in the dark blue are the ones who did go fishing and had stressful events. And it's across 3 different surveys. So survey 1, if you went fishing, you were less likely to have low wellbeing. So things were a little bit better. Same with the second survey, same with the third survey. So that's a pretty significant result. We then finally looked at wellbeing pathways. So with that, we were looking at all the different things. So out of the hundreds of things that can impact your wellbeing, and there are tons of them, which are the ones that fishing might be affecting? Because it's not actually going to affect every single thing that acts as a pathway to wellbeing. Past studies say it's physical exercise, nature connection, social connection, relaxation, and cultural identity. We found plenty of evidence for some of those. So we found fishing contributes to meeting your minimum physical activity levels if you're an avid fisher. So a typical 3-hour fishing trip, we actually asked people about their levels of activity. We translated that into the recommended measure of moderate physical activity levels that's used by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And we found that a typical 3-hour fishing trip provides 50% of recommended minimum weekly physical activity. If you go fishing a lot, that obviously adds up to a lot over the year. If you only fish once or twice a year, it's a pretty small contribution. But for our avids, it's pretty important. We also found if you go fishing with others, you're more likely, and if you value that social connection, you're more likely to have high wellbeing. So social connection. People who fish a lot are more likely to say they frequently spend time with families and friends, and they're more likely to be satisfied with their personal relationships. Although a couple of fishers I've spoken to said they were surprised by that and were going to tell their wives. In terms of social connection, a large proportion of fishers say fishing is a really important way they maintain connections with their family and friends. And just a very quick note on fishing alone. One of the questions we had was, is it good for your wellbeing to go fishing alone? Because some people say, I fish to get away from it all, including my family. So is our recommendation that you always have to fish with your family? No, it's actually not. But our recommendation would also not be that you fish alone all of the time, because up to about half of your fishing being done on your own, that's fine for your wellbeing. But if all of your fishing is done alone, you tend to have poorer wellbeing. Now, because my time is up, I'm going to briefly say we also found connections for nature connection, restoration and relaxation pathways. And in conclusion, yes, going fishing is good for your wellbeing. But for the greatest benefit, you need to like fishing. If you hate fishing, you won't actually get a wellbeing benefit from going fishing. So I can't stress that enough. Ideally, go fishing with other people for at least some of your fishing trips, and make sure you're working on appreciating the nature connection, relaxation and restoration benefits. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. I think everyone in the room already knew that, Jackie. Did we need the science to do that? Excellent. So now we have Andy up again. We're just loading his slides up for us again. So this presentation is on recreational fishers as stewards for the environment. So this is also a really interesting one and something that's not really been looked at in Australia. So a very interesting result as well. Looking forward to this one, Andy.
Thank you, Sean. I suppose just before getting into this topic, I think, just reflecting on Jackie's work, some of the most interesting stuff in this whole survey is just what Jackie talked about, and I think it's absolutely fascinating stuff, and certainly something that we should look in at more focus in the future. I think there's a lot in that, very, very happy that we're able to delve at that level throughout the survey. So, as Sean said, this talk is about recreational fishers as stewards for the environment. It's certainly something that we wanted to look at throughout the survey, and whether fishers are associated with being stewards of the environment, how they felt about the activity. And so one of the things that we're able to ask is, do you feel that you're a steward of the environment? And the majority of people said yes, they do. They took that fairly seriously, and they identified a range of activities that they felt contributed to being stewards of the environment. And as you can see there, a whole range of activities from picking up rubbish. 75% of people said they picked up rubbish. Others that donated to organisations that looked after aquatic health, reporting environmental problems, through to habitat work, doing habitat restoration, as we saw with Ozfish this morning, fantastic stuff, and taking part in clean-up days, so a whole range of things, and I'll talk about some of those reporting things shortly, but I think it's fair to say that rec fishers do see themselves as stewards of the environment and feel like they actively participate in maintaining that throughout their fishing life. One of the things that keeps on coming up through this survey, and there's one piece of data here about higher avidity. And so, as I mentioned before, we didn't only look at avidity; we looked at how much fishers valued what they did and how much they valued fishing. But in all those metrics, it was the same. If you did more fishing and you valued fishing more, then you felt like you contributed to the environment more, that you felt like you were an environmental steward more. So avidity and passion for fishing really made a big difference in a whole range of metrics. And we can see that across a range of data that when recreational fishers were out in the environment, they said that they actively witnessed illegal activities, dumping, environmental degradation, illegal fishing activities, a whole range of things. And again, that was higher for avid fishers. As you can imagine, if they're spending more days on the water, they're exposed to more of those things. And they gave it and again, fishers with a higher importance found the same thing. So that they were witnessing illegal activity and destructive behaviour, and they were much more, they were happy to contribute and report on those particular issues. Again, trying to pick this up through the data, picking up rubbish and those sort of things was very, very common. But I think for me, one of the interesting things out of this is that potential to report that activity, to talk about environmental degradation or people breaking the rules. We certainly get that back from the state fisheries agencies, where a lot of the reporting that's done of illegal activity is done by recreational fishers. So self-reporting is a big one. And also of participating in things like habitat restoration and rehabilitation. So one of the other bits that we really looked at in this was whether recreational fishers felt like they were responsible citizens, responsible fishers. And we asked a range of questions throughout the survey to get a handle on this. And that was, simple things like complying with the rules and regulation, bag limits, size limits, those types of things. And it wasn't only whether they were happy to comply with it, but it was also whether they had the knowledge to do that, whether they felt like they were informed enough to make those decisions regularly. And they can assess whether the catch meets those requirements, whether they were good at handling fish so that they had lower release mortality for the fish that they released. They can actually actively identify the species that they're coming in contact with. That they can comply with boundaries of closed areas, protected areas, and some even had good information on stock status of species and the things that they were targeting. So they'd read up a lot on that relevant information, which I found really interesting. I mean, it was a lower percentage than some of the other categories, but I think it's a really important factor there. And that your confidence as a responsible fisher increased with avidity and how much you valued fishing. Again, those two metrics came out together, but not for everything. So, the more you fished, the more you felt like you had those particular skills, and the more you read up on this stuff, again, you had the skills to be able to be a responsible fisher. The other category that really came out in the environmental stewardship stuff was learning and teaching. And we see that, again, that a lot of fishers associated with being up to date on information, as I've just discussed, but also that they actively participated in teaching their peers or children or others in the sport, whether they're learning a new technique, whether they're passing that on to children, where they're actively participating in open days, that a lot of people associated with being able to teach other people, that they had the skills and the want to do that, and they actively did it, that they actively sought out information that helped them make better decisions, whether that was demonstrating best handling practices, one, that they were able to get hold of that information, to understand it and then disseminate it to others, I think was fairly powerful. They taught people about responsible fishing, so good fish handling practices and in general good fishing practices, like picking up your fishing line and your rubbish after you leave, those types of things. And that they'd encourage other fishers. So again, what we see, and we're seeing it now with things like tuna champions, again, it's about that peer-to-peer pressure to do and certainly change behaviour that typically we don't get a whole lot of stakeholder change from governments typically. But when we actively involve fishers in peer-to-peer education, we get much better outcomes and much faster outcomes, and we're certainly seeing that with tuna champions and other things of the same ilk. That fishers were fairly keen to teach other people new tips and techniques. Again, we're seeing that in a lot of the tournament fishing these days, where the really top fishers are sharing what they're doing. You know, they're not actively hiding it, even though some of the prize pools are fairly large. But there's an active role there to pass on the things that they're learning day to day on the water and pass that on within the same tournament. And I think that's a fantastic thing. So again, we're seeing more and more of this learning ability to seek out information, to disseminate, to process that information, and again pass it on to other people in the sector. Again, more on that, it was a fairly good willingness by higher avids to participate in that. You know, the more avid you were, the more you looked at seeking out that information, and you were happy to pass it on. So again, the same kind of trend with people who both valued what they were doing and were highly avid. We also looked at citizen science. So again, the majority of people were happy to participate in citizen science. Again, reporting catch, taking part in stock assessments, fish frame programs, that type of thing, reporting sighting specific aquatic species, range expansions, uploading pictures of their catch, those types of things, and right down to taking water samples. So that people were there. And look, they've got the category there, maybe, it depends. And so I think, some people just needed justification. It wasn't an open-ended thing that they would do it, but if they saw the use in it, they were happy to contribute. And again, willingness to contribute. Really, there was, I suppose the thing that stood out here for me was happy to contribute to future science, but needed some sort of guarantee. So there was still about how that information would be used. So they're still happy to participate, but wanted some idea of how that information will be used, and that it wasn't going to be used to lock them out of the particular activity that they wanted to do. So that came across fairly strongly as well. That's about it for that section. I mean, in the report, those who want to download it, there's a whole chapter devoted to this. There's a lot of information in there. If you want to go and have a look at that, it's really detailed. So hopefully that's been useful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. No, I think that's really, really useful data. As someone who works in the space of education and stewardship, we've seen some really good presentations here, not only locally, AusFish, but also abroad with Keep Fish Wet. That kind of information can really help tailor how you approach those groups and work effectively between the sector and the stewardship program. So excellent. Next up, we have Jacki again. So this will be the last talk in the session today. It is on, do recreational fishers have a social licence to operate in Australia, which I think is a really interesting one at an international conference, because there are plenty of countries where the social licence around recreational fishing may not be what we have here. So a really interesting one to get on the front foot with this. So, Jacki, thank you.
All right, and we'll make this not too long, so there's a bit of time for questions. But we did want to talk about what we found about this. Now, I think how many here have had talks about social licence? You feel like you're pretty, we've heard plenty about it, haven't we? So we know the importance of social licence. We know that if we have social licence for an activity, we get support for investment and it continuing. We also know it helps people feel confident to keep taking part in it, although that part we often don't emphasise enough, I think. And when an activity loses social licence, we get public pressure to stop or limit it, high levels of regulation, reduction in access to resources. And one that often goes a bit missed is that often you get a lot of increased costs of engaging in that activity. So as part of the National Rec Fishing Survey, this wasn't a major objective with measuring social licence, but we did have a lot of opportunity to measure it. So we took the opportunity to measure a simple measure of social licence that reflects the idea that social licence is not a continuum. It's not just a yes, you've got it, no, you don't. It's something where people might find an activity anything from not at all acceptable to very acceptable, or they might just be unsure. A lot of people, if they don't know much about an activity, they won't know about it. So we did collect data twice because the Regional Wellbeing Survey already includes questions using that measure. So we added recreational fishing into that measure. I won't go through the methods again, but the data I'm presenting is from our general population survey, not the ones targeted recreational fishers. So we're reflecting the views of the general population about recreational fishing. And taken from our 2018 survey, we did repeat the data in our final survey and got almost identical results. So the first headline is that if we look at how acceptable people find recreational fishing, we asked people, how acceptable would you find recreational fishing if it happened in your local area, or if when it does happen, if they're somewhere where it does? We've also asked that question different ways. And we can put people on that scale from 1 to 7. Here we've grouped it a bit. So we've said unacceptable is a score of 1 to 2 on that scale I showed on the previous slide. Low to moderate acceptability is 3 to 4, high acceptability is 5 to 7, and then we've got our don't knows. So 61% of the Australian adult population finds recreational fishing not just acceptable but highly acceptable. Another 18.1% find it somewhat acceptable, only 8.2% find it unacceptable, and 12.7% are not sure. And that compares pretty favourably to a range of other activities that rely on natural resources. Examples there, you can find them in the report. What was really useful about us looking at it is not so much getting that headline figure, we already have known that from other studies. It's more that we had a big enough sample that we could start to look at and disaggregate that information and say, what predicts whether a person will be more or less likely to find recreational fishing socially acceptable? And we broke the data down into lots of groups and compared them. So I'm going to start with the one that we think matters almost the most, and that is, to what degree have you had contact with fishing in your life? So on this graph, the very top line, if you are a person who fishes and other people in your household fish, 71% of people find rec fishing acceptable. If you've never fished yourself but other people in your household do, 65% acceptability with high acceptability. If you fish but other people in your household have never fished, it's actually a bit lower. And if neither the person who was doing the survey or other people in their household had fished, only 44.9% acceptability. In other words, having contact with people who fish increases acceptability. It seems like a simple message, but it's a really important one. So we need to think about what's the implications of that. And note that down the bottom there, they're not actively opposed to rec fishing, they're just a lot more uncertain about it. So they're not knowing enough to know, do I have a view one way or another? That's the biggest change. We also looked at gender and age. There wasn't massive differences between men and women, although women were a bit more likely to be uncertain, but there was a big difference by age. That starts at the third row in this graph. That's our 18 to 24-year-olds, 48.7% acceptability, and they've got 11.8% unacceptability. And as people get older, acceptability increases, unacceptability decreases. We don't know yet. Is that something that is a normal part of lifespan and it changes? Or is this a generational change in how people view rec fishing? We also found if you live in a big city, you're less likely to find recreational fishing acceptable. And this may be in interaction with the fact that you're less likely to go fishing as well. Whereas if you live in rural or regional or remote areas, much more likely to find it acceptable. So that means we've identified several areas for further investigation. We know recreational fishing has a pretty good level of social licence, but we need to better understand things like, to what extent does lower direct contact with fishing explain the lower social licence we found amongst our younger Australians and our urban Australians? What other factors might be contributing there? With the young people who are finding it less acceptable, is that likely to change as they get older? Or is that actually reflecting a generational change that we need to worry about? Do we need programs that help people who've got know no one who goes fishing to get in contact with fishing, and can that replicate the effect of being introduced to fishing by family and friends? And we also need to know a lot more about what is it that's driving views about acceptability. So is it things like your views about touching fish? We found in some of our other work that that was an issue, for example. Is it your views about governance of fishing? We need more work into that. Final slide. So I think I've pretty much said this. We do see relatively high levels of social licence, but we need to keep looking specifically, digging under those figures and saying what's emerging and what do we need to understand so we can keep it that way and address any emerging issues early. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So do you guys want to come up on stage and we can ask some questions? So the executive summary, I believe there is a limited number of these at the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation stand. And Patrick, the full report is now live on your website. So frdc.com.au. He's nodding, I think. Travis.
Hi, it's Travis here. I've got a question and a statement, but I'll start with my statement. Really great job, like fantastic work, and like they're just fascinating results. One of the challenges that we have in Victoria at different times are the perceptions from some people that recreational fishing is inconsistent with other values. So if you're jogging around a lake, or if you're wanting to observe birds on the water, or other forms of passive recreation. So I suppose, Jackie, my question comes to social licence. In terms of exploring that further and that social licence for recreational fishing, what are the opportunities that we have to demonstrate that recreational fishing in itself is a passive activity that isn't going to compromise people that want to be there to watch birds or to go jogging around lakes or to others? Because there is this perception, particularly in highly urbanised areas, that fishermen are going to get in the way of joggers, they're going to disturb birds, people are going to get caught in the eye with hooks and those sorts of things. So I'm really interested in your thoughts there on that social licence and how we can build that, in the face of some of these other arguments.
Damn, I was thinking the first question would be to Anders about the economics. Okay, so with social licence, one thing we really know from a whole range of studies is that it's the small proportion of people who do the wrong things that give a bad reputation. So one of the best actions that can be done is fishers being constructive and making sure they call it out when they see another person doing the wrong thing, because that's where some of those views really, come out. So stewardship. I think one of the best things you can do is, the fishers should be the first to call it out when you see something that is interfering, and that way people build that confidence that, oh, hang on, okay, most people do the right thing and they'll call it out. They'll take care of that before I need to worry about it. So that's top of mind for me. We didn't explicitly look in the study at those interactions, but you've made me think of a really fun analysis I could do. So sadly, I'll probably end up having a look at that. Email me and we'll have a look.
Any other questions? Adam?
Thanks. Before I ask the question, I really appreciated all your presentations personally, but Jackie, yours is probably the wellbeing one was by far my most favourite for the whole conference so far. I've been waiting 18 months to ask this question for Jackie. In the wellbeing space, what are some of the primary research and development oriented projects that we can begin right now and in the near future?
Okay, and this is a question Adam has asked me before, and my answer's slightly different now to the answer I gave previously. And by the way, you hurt Anders' feelings by saying the wellbeing was the most interesting one. Look at him. So look, there is so much work to be done in this space. I think if I had to go top of mind, it's really looking at frequency of fishing, what types of fishing, how many people, whether people who take up fishing for the first time can get a wellbeing benefit from it. But I really want to see more studies that look at things like the emerging nature prescription movement. So doctors prescribing not an antidepressant, but saying I'm going to prescribe a prescription which gets you free access to national parks or a free fishing licence for the next month for you to use, or you can take this voucher to a tackle shop and get some gear. We're seeing that happening in some countries. We need studies that look at the effectiveness of that compared to what's being prescribed otherwise. We need more intervention studies like that that really show it, but we also need to look at that long-term maintenance of wellbeing. I think we've got a lot of studies showing specific benefits of fishing for things like recovering from mastectomies, but we don't have that, how does it work when you're just stopping the wellbeing from dropping, you know? So I want to be tracking people through those stressful periods, seeing how fast they recover, all those sorts of things. You're probably looking for a few other things there as well, but they're the ones that are standing out for me at the moment.
Very exciting answer, Bob.
Well, thank you very much for great presentations from the three of you. Jacki, just a comment. AFTA's been behind the wellness research and the importance to medical benefits to the individual, so we congratulate you on the work on that. But my question is to our economist. And we love the fact that you've broadened the scope to look at the whole of economic contribution. But what would have been more helpful was not only that figure, but against a direct spend in equipment and direct jobs. Now, you've mentioned the 29,500 people that work directly in the fishing tackle trade, but the economic spend direct as against the whole of GDP spend. So we can look at a step-up measure. So $1 spent on fishing tackle, by the time it flows through the whole of the economy, might be $5.
Can you hear me? This on? Yeah. There is the final report was up on the website this morning, and then you'll see a lot more information, a lot more tables and whatnot information in there than you've seen so far today. And some of that does go into the detail of expenditure, which is it's an important input into working out what the economic contribution is. So it's presented there for that reason. If you remember the pie chart that I put up there with the 5 categories, that's also a key breakdown that you'll see there in the report. So you can look at the relative contribution of those different parts.
Patrick?
Just checking, no one behind me. Well done. So Patrick Cohn, Fisheries R&D Corporation. Andy, so how often should we do this? What lessons have you learnt? And what questions should have we done? And it's a bit like what we've been asked. What should have we included? Because obviously we're really interested in trend data. And lastly, do we think the data that we are collecting, it's a lot of questions, is going to be relevant to decision makers?
You've got 2 minutes, Andy.
Oh, thanks, Patrick. I suppose deferring. I'm a lowly scientist. I don't get to make the call on how often we do these things. Maybe I'll flick it back and say however often the FRDC wants to pay for it. But jokes aside, I personally, rather than a government position, my own personal thing is 5 years would be a really useful thing. And I think that snapshots are useful for some things, but what we're going to really learn is how do we follow these metrics through time? What do they tell us through time? And, there's a whole bunch of metrics in here about the Australian population and whether things like wellbeing change through time. We've just been through COVID and all sorts of awful things. So, potentially following these metrics over time is more important than, one-off snapshots every now and then. So 5 years would make sense to me. Sorry, what was the second question?
What gaps do you think, on reflection, we should have?
There's nothing really. I'm very happy with. Yeah, look, and certainly the jurisdictions have asked me about catch. I think, and so the common question is, would you suggest this technique? So online surveys, to look at catch. And one of the things that we've seen with existing surveys that do it really, really well is the phone diary surveys, where they're actively ringing up and asking people about the fishing, so they're keeping people in the survey longer. The person, if they're skilled, they have a rapport with that person, so the person wants to answer the question. That's really powerful. And I think there's also some of the data cleansing that happens at the time. So, if the guy says he's been to Bateman's Bay and he's fishing 20 k's up the river and he caught a yellowfin tuna, if the reviewer actually knows something and say, well, sure you didn't mean a yellowfin brim? Oh yeah, that was it. So I think if we incorporate those kinds of things, we have to really think about how we do that. And maybe, there's a list of species in their particular area which they can click on. And so they get the visual cue and they can say, I clicked on, I caught 5 of these or whatever. So I think we have to think about how we potentially do that. But is there any more information? I don't think so. I mean, I think this has been so comprehensive in nature and asking questions that we've never asked before. In saying that, every time we ask a new question, you go, oh, well, what if we asked it this way? So, more things in line with that, as Jacki's just said, with a whole range of things, that what is that? What we were seeing before with that younger generation, 18 to 24-year-olds. So, is their perception of fishing different because they're young and that's a normal phenomenon? People have different ideas when they're young and they change as they get older. Or is it because lots of young people aren't being introduced to fishing because historically they got introduced to fishing on family holidays when the family went to the beach or the lake or the river or whatever, and for the last 5 or 10 or 15 years they've been going to Bali or Europe or somewhere. So, are they fundamental changes? And potentially we're going to be able tracking that through time will give us more insight into that.
Okay, excellent session. I would like to thank these authors. It's a massive job, and I think on behalf of the Australian recreational fishing community, it is an amazing contribution. So let's thank all the speakers today. And thank you for coming along.